Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Dreamscript and this is the Rough Cut Diamond Mines, the place I go to find the rough ideas that we can then maybe turn into something a little more polished. Surprise! You all saw we had one more artifact on the list last time, and I think you can all guess by now that I just wasn't going to leave it alone just because it was an optional prompt. I'm way too much of a completionist to allow myself such peace. But either way, I decided that I hadn't tormented enough innocent characters for this challenge, so we're going to have one last round with this list. Now, let's get to our prompt details. So, our last prompt on the list is listed as balance/scales. I'm going to go with the latter of the two because I did try looking up if there was a physical thing called a balance, and that was just more of the same stuff as a scale, so that's what we're doing. Which is an interesting concept because a set of scales isn't usually something that, even in fantasy settings, would be considered to be cursed. Magical, yes. Not necessarily cursed. So let's fix that, shall we? Now, making a cursed set of scales, to me, that feels like a worse version of the scales used by the Egyptian god Anubis during the weighing of the heart ceremony that's supposed to tell the god if you were a person of virtue or sin when set against the feather of truth. And while I personally don't know the pass-to-fail ratio of those ceremonies, I can't imagine it was one necessarily in favor of the human heart. Unless we're talking about a stupid heavy feather, of course, but that's beside the point. I think I should get my curse severity to know how bad it's gonna be. For a set of scales, this somehow feels more important for the wheel than usual, but hey, let's do this one more time. Spin that wheel! What do we got? Oh! Dangerous? A scale with an AoE effect? Okay then! Well, this is gonna be interesting. So, one thing that I doubt anyone actually saw or cared about was that at the beginning of the year, I put up a poll both here on YouTube and on my Instagram, and that poll gave 3 choices of stickers, sort of, that I was considering for this particular prompt. And those were these set of fish, which are actually a set of patches, but we'll just ignore that, this crystal skull realistic skull combo, and finally this combo of a potion label for bottled common sense and a planchette for a Ouija board. Each one of these would have resulted in a very interesting cursed set of scales, I think. The problem was I didn't get votes on either site. No one's fault but mine. In hindsight, it was really silly of me to assume that I could put up a poll so early in this channel's lifespan and expect to get any returns on it in a timely fashion. And it's been up there for a while. But regardless, after thinking on it and this curse severity in mind, I ended up deciding to go with the common sense and planchette. But that's all the elements for this one. Let's head over to the refinery and craft our final cursed artifact. Alright, so we're making a cursed set of scales that has ties to common sense or logic and superstition or general beliefs of a wide area. And since I already discussed the Egyptian mythology take on a scale, my mind was already primed so that my first thought was to make this some kind of artifact that was another one of those technically divine connections. Kind of like what I did with the incense prompt. Whether or not it is actually divine could be something for later discussion. But the idea that I first had was one that could potentially shift the mental belief of an entire city. Like how there are a number of times when superstitions take a stronger hold in the hearts and minds of a community, stirring up fear and paranoia to the point where it causes people to do monstrous things, like the whole witch burning craze that occurred in Salem, or everything that was going on in Germany in World War II, just to name a few examples. Yeesh. Now, just to be clear, I don't necessarily see this as an artifact that actively forces people to make those kinds of decisions, but it can certainly put people more into the headspace where they might be more likely to actually go through with such decisions and actions. Like, maybe it has an effect that shifts the core beliefs held in greater importance in the hearts of the people surrounding it. Like how one day everyone can be perfectly okay with somebody making up for their mistakes of the past, but the next day they will freely condemn others for those same mistakes with no regard of the fact that they were previously forgiven. That kind of stuff, if I'm making any semblance of sense. All that gaslighting, gatekeeping kind of nonsense that people in high positions of powers, politicians especially, thrive on. So that's the general kind of gist for this particular cursed item. For design, I had originally been planning on making them somewhat unassuming, I guess, possibly even looking like a set of scales that might have once belonged in old-fashioned banks and loan houses. But, like most of my designs, it ended up being a little more ornate than that, and who am I kidding? You guys know that means a lot. It's affecting something far beyond material weight, after all. It needs to look a little special, right? But all looks aside, let's get into the juicy part of this item, and I can tell you the story of this, the true final cursed relic. Enjoy. It's said that people only believe a lie unconditionally for 3 seconds. And for it to stick around longer than that, more people have to believe in it at the same time. The biggest secret to any successful community and leadership is to have everyone agree to believe the same lie at the same time. Everyone does not need to believe the lie to the same extent. They only need to believe in it at all. Which lie they are being asked to believe changes from place to place, decade to decade, possibly even day to day in the most turbulent of nations. But there was one nation that had mastered this particular secret and even learned how to sway it in its leaders' or would-be leaders' favors. It seems that with every new leader, the people there are able to easily accept new laws set forth with little more than a few grumbling complaints when it made things inconvenient. Uprisings from unhappy people are a completely foreign concept within the nation, for both the better or worse of those same people. And there are many that want to learn this powerful secret. War is not an uncommon thing of nations in such times. War to defend one's resources that another nation wants is especially common. Such things are the reasons this nation has invested in building a particularly strong military force and great walls to keep out all potential enemy forces. So the only way the enemy spy had to enter the nation at all was under the guise of a traveling merchant. Their progress slowed as they were weighed down with the resources that were deemed valuable to the nation. It was going to be a long mission, as they had to win the trust and favor of the people of the nation while they made their way towards the capital, but one that would be worth it to their homelands if they could learn the nation's secret for keeping its people strong and in line. It took weeks for the spy to make the less than optimal trip to the capital, visiting as many of the little towns that was the traditional merchant's path as they could, learning as much as they could from the people themselves. These people seemed to believe anything they were told by their officials, even, and especially oddly, when the spy had spoken with the people and heard them speak negatively of certain ideas before they were put into governmental effect. Even they themselves couldn't bring themselves to argue with the officials, which confused them. If they couldn't get the secrets within the nation, they were supposed to sow seeds of rebellion. But even with the laws they knew were not for the benefit of the people, they couldn't bring themselves to actively suggest such thing. Was there something wrong with them? Or this place? Something in the local water, perhaps? Whatever the reason, they continued on their push towards the capital, finally reaching it and managing to secure a small dwelling space near the marketplace, close to the buildings that housed the leaders and lawmakers. A perfect location to set up their base of operations until they could learn this secret. They kept an eye on everything that happened in the marketplace, keeping a lookout for anything that might tip the nation's hand in its secret. But to the spy's frustration, there were no patterns or anything that looked outside the ordinary from their own homelands. Growing desperate, they realized they were going to have to sneak into the leader compound itself. No easy feat, considering it was always crawling with guards and soldiers. But if they were to learn anything, they had to take the risk. Further weeks of preparation and planning is what it took But eventually, the spy found a crack in the area's defenses, and a tiny, unassuming hut on the edge of the compound became their way in. The compound was enormous and centered around an enormous building that towered over much of the surrounding town. From outside the compound, the spy had thought the building to be some kind of timekeeping place for the town. The ringing of bells from the building always sounded at the same time each day to signal to people when the day was coming to a close. But for such a building to be at the center of the capital city to the nation itself, it had to house more than just a bell for timekeeping. The spy was certain of it. The entry of the building betrayed nothing of its importance, being a plain room that only served to lead the way up to the stairs. No grand decor or engravings that could suggest it anything more than an oversized bell tower. Still, the spy continued up the building, keeping to the shadows at all times and taking care not to make even the slightest sounds as they stepped. And their diligence was rewarded. At the very top of the tower, just below the spot where the bells would be rung, the spy reached a floor that screamed of unspoken importance. A large round room with tall backed stone seats set along the wall in rows, looking into the center of the room where a chest rested on a stone dais. The walls were engraved with depictions of a humanoid figure holding two orbs in their hands, as if in perfect balance, with waves radiating out from them. Tapestries of important events of the city also hung on the walls, such as the building of their armies and walls. In each tapestry, that same figure was in the heading details, one of its hands always held higher than the other. This had to be some kind of council hall for the leaders. But why was it so high over the city? What did that figure symbolize for these people? The nation didn't have such a figure as its banner or on any of its monuments. Was it some symbol of leaders and the decisions they made in each event? Maybe. Still, a little strange that such a symbol wasn't seen anywhere else in the nation. The spy slowly began to approach the chest in the middle, curious to see what was in it, but as they do, they start to hear the sounds of dozens of feet coming up the stairs behind them. In a rush of panic, the spy ducks behind one of the tapestries in the furthest corner of the room, hiding just in time to not be spotted as the crowd of people enter the room. The crowd moves through the room, filling the rows of seats with calm steps. The spy held their breath as they peeked out from behind the tapestry to see some of what was happening. All the figures in the room are dressed in long official robes worn by the lawmakers of the nation. And standing in the center of the room was the nation's leader. The leader was standing with his hands on the chest, speaking out to the assembled people. He spoke of the needs of the nation and seemed to be putting a strange question before the group. Should a nation's people dedicate themselves to the labor of their fields or the defense of their nations? The leader asked, and the assembled group began to debate. The whole thing confused the spy. Surely there were discussion halls in the buildings below. Why was such a conference occurring in this high tower and with this strange room? And so late at night? The debate goes on for what feels like a long while, before eventually the group decides the nation's armies need more bodies. Not all of them, but more than they currently had. Once this decision was agreed upon, the leader opened the chest. The spy narrows their eyes as they watch the leader pull a set of scales into view, and along with the scale, a small bag is also pulled from the chest. As the leader sets the chest aside, the scales on the dais seem to pulse with power. The spy watches from their hidden spot as the scales start to glow. The leader of the lawmakers spreads his arms wide. Spirits of change, allow us to change hearts and minds, he said aloud, and the scale glows with a brilliant light. A light that starts to take the form of a humanoid figure holding two orbs. The figure does not speak, but even from their corner, the spy can tell the spirit is asking which aspects of hearts and minds are being changed. We seek to change the people's desire to labor in their fields and defend these lands, the leader says as an answer. The figure nods and holds out the 2 orbs it holds to the leader. The symbol of farming tools and plants appearing on one, and a shield and sword on the other. And the leader begins to pour the contents of the bag, which seems to be a fine, glowing white sand, into the orb with the shield and sword. They did pour some into the other orb, but most of the bag did go into that first one. When the bag was empty, the scale on the dais tilted to the one side, showing the orb that had been filled with more sand, and a wave of that sand travels out from the figure, rushing out from the room and likely over the entire nation. As the figure fades away and the scales fall back into a neutral stance, the light ebbs away. As the light dims, the room is left feeling darker than before, and once the scales were returned to the chest, the gathered lawmakers begin to file out of the room. From their corner, the spy stays frozen until they heard the echoing of the group's footsteps finally drift away into the distance. Their heart was racing at this point. This was it. They had learned the secret of this nation's keeping its people happy and in line with the leader's needs. That set of scales was the cause of it all. But what do they do with this information? Stealing the scales isn't a viable option. Not at this time. The borders of the nations are days away, even by the fastest means of travel. They would never make it out before the lawmakers realized they had taken the scales. But as they come out of their hiding spot, the spy stares at the chest as an idea occurs to them. As the scales could really influence the way people thought and felt about things, could they themselves use it to cause the people to rebel against the lawmakers? Any chaos such an event would trigger in an unprepared government might be more than enough to steal the scales away from their own nation. The spy stared at the chest, mentally trying to decide what would be the best place to start degrading the obedience of the nation's people. How quickly did the scales' powers take effect? Was it an immediate overnight thing? Or did it take time? How much time? They didn't know enough about how this strange item works to guess how much messing around they would get away with before anyone realized what they were doing. Could they even do anything tonight after the lawmakers had already used it? They just didn't know. So, they take a deep breath, open the chest, and pull the scales out on the dais. They pick up the bag of sand. Spirits of change. Allow me to change hearts and minds. The spy says to the scales, and they have to shield their eyes as the scales begin to glow once more. They look up at the humanoid figure as it stands over them. The expression of the figure is neutral, looking down at them with nothing more than passive attention. And the spy could now hear the spirit's voice. What do you wish to change in the hearts and minds of others? It asks, holding out the 2 orbs to the spy. The spy looks at them. 2 aspects they could change. Only 2. They take a deep breath once more. They tell the spirit their choice. They pour the sand, and they feel the wave of influence traveling outwards. It seems like it took a while for the influence to take full effect, but they could tell it was already there within the people as they began to voice their displeasure more frequently and louder with each passing day. This shift concerned the lawmakers, but they didn't know what caused it, and they also didn't set protections in place to stop the spy from reinforcing this change every night. More and more, the people grew angry with the lawmakers and any who tried to support them. Fights started breaking out in the marketplace between people and soldiers. Single individual fights that over time start to grow into full-out riots. Because of that, soldiers started abandoning their positions across the nation, much to the dismay and confusion of the lawmakers. It only took a matter of weeks for the spy to watch the entire nation begin to eat itself alive after they started making their own changes. By the time the people of the nation all rebelled at once against the capital, the spy knew they had done their job well. As the riots raided the lawmakers' compound, the spy slipped in with them, easily able to collect the chest with the scales. They then immediately began the long travel back to their homelands. Once they were a safe distance, they glanced back at the burning capital, when people are able to express their frustrations rather than repress them. And there we go. That is finally the actual end of the Cursed Relics Art Challenge prompt list of the year 2020. 16 different artifacts that I hope everyone had some fun with. This has honestly been a fun time for me, despite all the mishaps and setbacks in this series, and I've learned a lot of things while doing it. Not just about the different themes and elements I used during the prompts, but also about myself and the things that I get the most enjoyment out of in these kinds of videos for you all. Regardless of whether this encouraged you to try this prompt list out for yourself or not, I do hope that everyone took something that they could enjoy out of it. I still haven't even decided what we're gonna do next time, but that should be... What was that? What? Ouch!